Alright, everybody. The time has come, the walrus said, to start this stream back up again. So there's not a whole lot of news this week. The only thing that really needs to be said is I still haven't done the bibliography thing yet. I know I promised that to you guys, but nobody seems to care, so it's fine. Um, Hopefully I'll get that done soon, but it's not very high on my priority list. A bunch of stuff came up for classes this week, and I just haven't had time. Let's see, what else besides just selling random weapons here? Yeah, no, that's really the only thing I have this week to go over that isn't our primary topic, so let's get this shit out of the way. After I sell a couple of Tonfas. It's what, Heaven and Earth Tonfas? Let's get rid of these. Perfect. But yeah, so, enough about all that other bullshit. We're talking about Confucianism. And Confucianism is... Good lord, is it boring to read. That's like the only criticism... Well, a lot of criticisms, actually. It's the only thing I have to say on the topic. Personally, I do not like reading Confucian text. It's dry and boring and slow. But we're not talking about that first. Before we can get too far into Confucian ideals and Confucian thoughts and yada yada yada, we need to talk a little bit about context. We need to put things into context. That's what I'm trying to say. There we go. So we need to put some things into context first before we go all in. And the context we need to put it in is a couple of things. First and foremost, Confucianism is less of a religion, or at least that's how it started out. Inevitably, it will eventually get a lot of odd gods and all of this other stuff applied to it. But initially, it is not a full-blown religion. It's more of a philosophy than anything else. And we're going to focus on the philosophical part of it for the most part for this discussion. You see, Confucianism comes from a time in Chinese history that has come to be called the 100 Schools of Thought. This would have been during the spring and autumn periods, also known as the Warring States period, around the 6th century to 221 BC. This is when everything was like come up with and finalized and all of that. This is a time frame that obviously is known for the absurd amount of war that happened during that time frame, because of course it was. It is called the Warring States after all, but a lot of philosophies came out of this time frame. We're talking Confucianism. We're talking not Buddhism. That's an entirely different thing. We're talking Confucianism. We're talking legalism. We're talking Taoism. All of these different ideas that... What the fuck is forage? Oh, okay. Cool. Forage that way, then. Dick. There we go. So we're talking Confucianism, we're talking legalism, we're talking all of the Taoism. Can't forget Taoism. Yeah, we're talking all these different ideas. And this time frame, because of that, is considered a golden age of Chinese philosophy. And we'll cover Taoism and legalism in later episodes when we finally get around to those. It's so hard to pay attention to this game. Like, this is a game that's mindless, but it still requires attention. Kind of a pain. Anyway, but yeah, so we'll cover those topics later in another episode. But for right now, our main concern is going to be Confucianism and how all this went down. So people in this time frame are really scrambling for power, for philosophies to solidify their power. So because of this, there are tons of big ideas all over the place. So you've got a couple of them, like legalism, that were popular for a little bit and then fell by the wayside. Um, but for the most part, three of them sort of stood out over time. And the three that eventually stood out were legalism, Taoism, and Confucianism. And of the writings from this specific time frame, the only ones that I know of, off the top of my head, that actually survive, the only one is The Art of War, which was written in like literal, actual Art of War text from this time still exists. I could be wrong on that. I'm not 100% sure because I haven't done the extensive study to sort of figure out, where or exactly what all survived. But as far as I can tell from just a cursory look, that is pretty much everything that we've got. And you'll note, the more astute of you will note that that means that we have no Confucian text from this time frame, where it was supposedly created. Well, you guys would be right. We don't have any Confucian texts from that time frame, because Confucian texts weren't written in that time frame. The way things ended up working had to do with a couple of interesting things. First and foremost, Confucius didn't really write anything down from what we can tell. Yeah, he was all for learning, but he was all for talking more than he was learning. This led to a situation in which his ideas were just sort of handed off, and somebody else ended up writing them. And that somebody else that ended up writing them was a man by the name of Mencius. That's not the button I wanted to push. There we go. A man by the name of Mencius. Mencius lived, I want to say, 100 or 200 years after the time frame that we recognize as the life of the man we think was Confucius. Which brings us to another point. Confucius may not have been a person. Or, at the very least, he may not have been one person. See, the problem with Confucius is the name Confucius isn't a name. It's actually a sort of bastardization of the Romanized version of a title, Kung Fu Tzu, Kung Fu Tzu, which basically just translates to great teacher. That's why in the Analects, Confucius is never actually mentioned by name. He was only ever mentioned as the master. So it's an odd situation, to say the least. There's a lot going on there that needs to be unpacked to really fully get a grasp on it. So there's a good chance that... Alright, I need to back up a little bit. So, there is a man that we think may have been who we consider Confucius. Let's see. So, that person was a man by the name of Zhongni. And as far as we can tell, he did okay for himself. But because his time frame was about 200 years before Mencius's, that would mean that we have no fucking idea what the hell was actually going on at the time. So, and more importantly, Mencius wouldn't have had any idea what exactly Confucius was going on about at the time. So, there may be some bits that we aren't 100% sure about. But, yeah, basically everything in this text will be secondary sources for the most part. Out of their own texts, they are 100% secondary sources. The reason I bring up the fact that Zhongni may or may not have been the guy that was Confucius, is because since we since Confucius was a title rather than a name, it may have been that there were a lot of different great masters, and that this is more of a collection of ideas from all over the place. So, take it with a grain of salt, I guess, is the best thing I can say. And this is an issue that that historians always have to deal with, especially when dealing with ancient sources. Our sources, they're everywhere. Like, one of my professors likes to describe it as if you were to draw a line of about 10 feet. This is ad-libbing, unfortunately, but, well, misquoting, probably, but if you were to draw a line of about 10 feet, and then and that line represented how much we actually knew about, whatever ancient sources we were talking about, you could make a mark about 10 centimeters into that line, and that would be an accurate representation of what we actually knew from those time frames, the surviving sources from those time frames. So, yeah, history is not an easy concept for some people once you start getting into the nitty-gritty. There's no definitive, this guy totally did this, and there's no way to interpret it differently. Sources are from people who, like Mencius, would have looked up to Confucius to begin with. Sources are from, so many different places. Sources could come from people's enemies, like with the Vikings. A really popular phrase that people like to throw around is that history is written by the victors. When, in the case of the Vikings, that's less true, mostly because the Vikings didn't write any history on themselves. All of their enemies did. So, you gotta take that with a grain of salt, too. Like, using a lot of different sources and figuring out where everything comes from is of the utmost importance. So, oh shit, we're losing dudes. So keep that in mind. Pretty much whenever anybody is talking to you about history, whenever anybody is saying, oh, well, this totally happened, that person has no way of knowing if that exactly happened. But, enough about that. One of the main problems that crops up, specifically with Confucian thought, which is a little odd, is that it's really fucking confusing. It's really dense. It's really oddly written. It's loaded with anecdotes and references to things that you would need specific knowledge of the Warring States period to know. Knowledge that a lot of people just aren't going to do. Knowledge that I haven't done. And that's my area of expertise, after all. Like, that's what I study. But, there's a lot of... It's very dense, sort of labyrinthian work that you have to do a lot more studying to really get a full idea about. For instance, here's a line right out of the copy of the book that I'm using. Actually. Give me just a second here. I'm going to do a thing, and then something so I don't have to pay attention. Sweet. So, here's an exact quote from the book. The madman of Chu, Che Yu, passed by Confucius, singing and saying, O Feng, how is your virtue degenerated? As to the past, reproof is useless, but the future may still be provided against. Give up your vain pursuit. Give up your vain pursuit. Peril awaits those who now engage in affairs of government. Confucius alighted and wished to converse with him, but Che Yu hastened away so that he could not talk to him. Why did they have to put in, hey, this line twice? Hey, this line that doesn't mean anything? Hey, what the fuck does any of that even mean? Why was this line even there? It's not anything to think about, except for maybe the madman, who is prefaced as a madman. Like, this is the kind of shit you have to deal with when you're talking about Confucian thought. It's fucking labyrinthian. It's absurd and kind of droll. Very taxing. So, maybe I just didn't get everything that was going on in this book. I don't know. But take what I say with a grain of salt. But with those facts for context, let's dig into this Confucian philosophy. At its core, Confucian philosophy is about learning. The idea is that if you keep trying to learn, you will keep trying to become more virtuous as an individual. What Confucian philosophy believes is learning is where things start to get a little complicated. First and foremost, the master, as he is referred to throughout the text, believes that filial piety is one of the most important aspects of a person's life. Filial piety is a form of ancestor worship. The way that someone respects the spirits of their ancestors and handles their relationships with their parents is of utmost importance to Confucian thought. Being unfilial and neglectful in your duties to your parents gets you condemned as a fool and as an unvirtuous individual. Because this isn't actually a religion, it's more of a way of way of thinking about things, a philosophy. There aren't a whole lot of savage punishments or brutal punishments in Confucian thought. They mostly boil down to, if you don't do this, you're a fucking idiot. Because they don't want to be an idiot, because it's Confucian thought. So this is gonna be something that we'll note for some of our later work, where it's a huge difference between Confucian thought and legalism specifically. Legalism has a much more aggressive way of handling things. The next thing that Confucian thought tends to focus on is virtuous thought. What virtuous thought is a little in the air, but virtuous thought is required for every role in life. To be a good person, you need to have virtuous thought. To be, a good administrator, to be a good leader, to be a good anything, you have to have virtuous thought. The problem is, virtuous thought is a little bit ephemeral of a concept. Virtuous thought can take on a lot of different forms. Generally, though, it is generally speaking, it takes the form of doing things the way they should be done. And the way things should be done, according to Confucian thought, is the way that they've always been done, with no change or shift whatsoever. It's a very traditionalist view of things. If that's the way they've been done forever, you have no reason or right to change the way that they're done. Which means that, at the end of the day, what Confucian thought boils down to is less learn new things, and more do things the way they're supposed to be, and learn things that other people said, and if you do things the way that everybody else tells you to do them, then you're a smart man. So, if you're doing something that has been done before, then you should do it the way that it's always been done. If you're doing something new, why are you doing something new? Knock that shit off and get back to learning. So, yeah, Confucian thought tends to believe that learning means studying tradition and memorizing it. To a Confucian thinker, if you can recite the Odes, which is a group of poems and writings from before even Zhongni's time, then you are a well-learned individual. And if you take those lessons and make use of them in a modern context, then obviously you are an intelligent person who should be revered. Other than that, the rest of the book is basically dedicated to being a smartass and getting away with it. Confucian thought was prominent off and on in Chinese culture up until the Communist Revolution in the reign of Mao Zedong, who decided that Confucian thought was what was holding back China from progressing into the future. It was in this off-and-on time frame that Taoism and Confucianism sort of kept going back and forth for a little while. Of course, Mao Zedong, having decided that Confucianism was bad, also decided that pretty much everything else was bad. Um, and it led to some weird situations. Most importantly, it led to an instance where Mao Zedong basically said, hey, someone agrees with the way I think, so if you plant things super close together and don't give them any room to grow or give them like individual attention, then obviously you'll be able to produce more, which actually straight up led to a famine at one point. So, Mao Zedong may not have been the best person to take advice from, but I think in this particular instance he may have had a point that Confucianism may not have been a good plan. Bit of a lateral movement, I guess. But get over here, Zhu Yi. Zhu He? Zhu He, yes. Holy shit, I can't grab everyone! I need to kill a thing before this timer runs out. Anyway, so yeah, a bit of a lateral movement there. To be honest, not my favorite topic, which is why we've got maybe 20 minutes of content rather than the usual 30 or so. Honestly, I had a hard time finishing the book. It's really dry content, really boring to me, which I think I've mentioned probably a couple of times. If you want to try to read it, the Analects are super easy to get a hold of. They've been reprinted a lot of times for academic sake, if nothing else. But yeah, no. What'd I do for you, motherfuckers? That's all I've got for this week. Next week, we will continue covering Eastern philosophies with Taoism as we try to struggle our way back to Romance of the Three Kingdoms and go back over some of those things and some of the research topics that I am poking around with. Hope to see you guys for Taoism. Hope everyone has a good time. Thanks for stopping by. Good night, folks.